Sunderland Museum and Historical Society, 14 Church Street North. This structure was built in 1972 as the Brock Township Public Library and was opened by Governor-General Roland Michener on June 11, 1972. Margaret Doble was the librarian here from 1975 to 1991. Other members of the library board were Dorothy Suggett, Norma Doble, Vera Wilkinson, and Donald Weatherall. The building was constructed through a provincial municipal employment incentive grant, the work of the Sunderland Lions Club, and many volunteers. After 2001, the Sunderland Public Library was moved to the Sunderland Public School on Albert Street, and this building was used as a museum by the Sunderland Historical Society. This society began in 1989, and 2009 is their 20th anniversary. In 2002, they received a $25,000 grant from the Ontario Trillium Foundation to modernize the building to allow for proper care of the artifacts and old documents. A new computer system and photocopying facilities help members put much of the historic information on a retrievable database. The museum now has thousands of archived artifacts and a detailed historical genealogy on early pioneer families. The Society works with other researchers and museums in Durham and York regions and genealogists from all over the world through their website. In 2003, this site became fully accessible with the addition of a wheelchair-access washroom and elevator. The walking tours were made possible through a federal New Horizons for Seniors grant in 2008. St. Andrew's United Church. Originally, this was the Wesleyan Methodist Church. The congregation was formed about 1852. The Methodists at first had circuit ministers who would ride about the countryside holding services in local homes and barns. About 1873, the Methodists built a white brick church here for their Sunday services. The land was owned by Henry Brether, and he sold it for $150. Before that, meetings were held from 1871 to 1873 in the old frame town hall next door. In 1907, a red brick church was designed by George E. Turner, and it was opened on February 23, 1908. A fowl supper was held the next night, and pledges were taken to pay off the $12,500 cost of the new building. Within 9 years, the church was free of this debt. In 1924, Methodists and Presbyterians joined to form the United Church of Canada. The Methodist Church was to be used as the place of worship, and some of the furniture and the organ was moved from the Presbyterian Church on Albert Street to this site. In 1928, the Presbyterian Church was sold to the King Edward Masonic Lodge Branch 464, Sunderland, for $825. Recently, the St. Andrew's United Church celebrated its 100th anniversary, and many changes have occurred since 1908. In 1946, the present pipe organ was installed, and finally, in 1951, the sheds for the horses and buggies were removed from the back of the church property. New stained glass windows were added to the auditorium, and the heating system went from wood to coal and then to oil. In 1979, the narthex and the sanctuary were both completely carpeted. For increased accessibility, a chair lift was added in 1980, and just last year a wheelchair access elevator was added thanks to a grant from the Ontario Trillium Foundation. This building is the site of many community activities and is used by the Lions Club for the music festival and the annual Christmas Bazaar. Sunderland Town Hall, 120 River Street. This town hall was constructed in 1906 on the site of a previous wooden frame town hall dating back to 1871. The architect and supervisor was George E. Turner. It is correctly named the Town of Brockship Town Hall, Sunderland. It took 2 years for the hall to be constructed, and the final cost was about $6,000. A fire insurance map from 1910 shows that the hall was used as a farmer's market downstairs and an opera house upstairs. For decades now, the building has been the social center of the town and township. It has been used for plays, musicals, fundraisers during the wars, and for over 50 years it has been the site of performances in the Sunderland Music Festival. The new structure has served not only Sunderland, but the surrounding township with its clerk's office, council chamber, banquet hall, jail, and small library. During the Great Depression, the jail cells were a place to stay overnight for jobless men passing through town. On the south wall of River Street is the impressive circular rose-shaped stained glass window of Gothic design. Behind this window is a large second-floor balcony with the original seats that were provided by Robert Charter, the local furniture dealer and undertaker. Those fold-up seats still have a rack underneath to hold a gentleman's hat. At the southwest corner is the 4-story bell tower where an iron bell once rung. The entire ceiling is made of tin metal plates impressed with detailed patterns. In 1991, a town hall restoration committee worked with Brock Township and the Sunderland Lions to bring the building up to fire code. They did major restorations to the washrooms and added an elevator. The windows are Romanesque with their round arches. Inside is a pavilion stage with an old-fashioned ticket room and a sloped concert floor. In front of the town hall is the cenotaph built in 1922 to honor the men killed serving Canada in the armed forces in both World Wars. (128) River Street. This home was built about 1904. Dr. Joseph Henry Oliver and his family lived in this 3-story house. His home had his living quarters as well as his office, consulting room, and a dispensary. At one time he was the medical officer of health for Brock Township. Dr. Oliver was one of the last country doctors to make house calls. Often, if a patient could not reach his office, he would gather up his medical supplies in all kinds of weather and go out to provide medical assistance. In his later years, the families of the patient would come and pick him up in a buggy or cutter, and in the summer his daughter Bessie would drive him about. He retired in 1954 at the age of 84 and lived to the age of 96. In 1914, his wife Elizabeth Martha St. John died about 6 months after his daughter Bessie was born. She was raised in this house by her 2 aunts. Dr. Oliver was a member of the official board of the Methodist Church and also served as a member of the 116th Battalion in World War I. As a veteran, he proudly attended the unveiling of the Vimy Monument in 1936. A recently discovered receipt for $2 for a math exam showed that he studied at Trinity College in Toronto for his medical degree. His daughter Bessie played the piano and organ at the Town Hall and the United Church, and was always running next door to the Town Hall to get books for children when the library was there. Dr. Oliver's 2 sisters helped to organize concerts and design the costumes for several plays at the Sunderland Town Hall. In the 1890s, Dr. Henry Oliver was a teacher at the SS4 Ridge School after he completed his high school education in Uxbridge. Gus Doyle, the future town constable, was one of his students. Dr. Oliver went to the University of Toronto and finished his first year. Then, in order to raise money to finish his degree, he worked as an assistant to a doctor in Northern Ontario for a few years. After he graduated with a medical certificate in Toronto, he returned home to Sunderland and was listed as doctor in the 1910 Ontario Gazetter for Sunderland. St. Mary's Anglican Church, River Street. This red brick church was built in the spring of 1874. The bricks came from the Cannington Brickyard and were supplied by William Wetherall and John Wakelin. The masonry work was done by William Bacon, Charles Spearin, and Mr. Reed. This building is one of the oldest structures in the village. The land for the rectory was donated by James Doble, who was a banker and owned many building lots in town. The rectory was located at the corner of Church Street South and Jones Street, on the northeast corner, and it was used by the ministers until about 1942. At that time, 4 Anglican churches used the same minister for their services. The rectory was sold about 1990 to fund the new Town Hall addition. The new parish hall behind the church was opened April 26, 1990. The new hall had a kitchen, washrooms, and a full basement. At one time, the minister's charge included Cannington, All Saints, Sunderland St. Mary's, St. James West Brock, and the Anglican Church in Beaverton. The building closed about 2003 as the congregation became too small to support the church, and the facility was sold by the Anglican Synod in Toronto. The cemetery for this church is west on Concession 6, River Street, to Durham Road 23. It's called Thompson Cemetery. 160 River Street, Dr. James McDermott Residence. Dr. James McDermott served this community for a 50-year span from 1870 until his death in 1920. He had an ad in the 1872 directory for the County of Ontario about his drugstore in the Porritt Block. J. M. McDermott, M.D., dealer in drugs and medicines, paints, oils, and dyestuffs, perfumery, fancy and toilet articles, pure wines and liquors for medicinal purposes. In 1910, he supervised and financed the building of the Brockhouse Hotel. Also by 1910, the huge building at River and Albert Street was known as McDermott Block. The McDermott Block burned down in 1949. Dr. James McDermott was born in Tecumseh Township in Simcoe County, and there were 11 children in the family. His parents were born in Ireland. He and his wife Jane Campbell had 3 daughters, Edith, Josephine, and Annie. 198 River Street, the Fogg House. Back in 1904, Thomas Fogg, an affluent owner of the Nipissing Hotel at River and Church Street in Sunderland, purchased this half-acre piece of property for the sum of $300 from Julius St. John. The original deed of purchase still hangs on the living room wall. He built a new home for his wife and daughter in 1907. This is a fine example of Victorian architecture featuring an impressive sweeping veranda, 3-story bay windows, and a number of stained glass windows. Inside there is oak paneling and wainscoting in the dining room and front hall, and ash wainscoting in the kitchen. The ceilings are made up of tin plate panels and were common for this time period. The staircase was made of oak with turned spindles and newel posts. The floors were made of pine boards. The Fogg family enjoyed their life in this fine home until Mr. Fogg lost most of his money through investments in the stock market. No one knows what happened to him after this misfortune, but his wife and daughter lived in the house and they were unable to meet their mortgage payments. Finally, in 1936, with the house standing empty, an auction was held, but no one bought the house. Later, Armour and Enid Martin and Lorne and Grace Banbury bought and shared this large home. Other owners were Stanley Doble, Fred and Mabel Wilson, and Gordon Lockey, a geography teacher at Brock High School. In 1967, Bill Urema, another teacher at Brock High School, moved in with his wife Joan and their 4 children. This family has restored the house and have always been diligent in maintaining its original turn-of-the-century features. Bill and Joan continue to enjoy this historic site that is over 100 years old. 135 River Street, the blacksmith shop. This building was once the blacksmith shop of Dan McIntyre. It was one of several dating back to the mid-1800s. Dan worked with several local apprentices to train them as blacksmiths. He taught William James Payne, who later started up his own blacksmith shop in Markham. Another local lad who worked for Dan was Fred Wilkinson, who had come to Canada as a Bernardo boy in 1899 when he was only 9. An original round steel frame, used for setting buggy wheels, was taken from the front lawn and moved to the front of the museum at 14 Church Street North in the fall of 2008. This steel frame was a huge circle of solid iron that was about 4 feet in diameter. It has a hole in the center and easily weighs about 100 pounds. The maps of 1904 and 1910 show the blacksmith shop here at this location. Dan is listed in the 1891 directory as a blacksmith in Sunderland. Dan used the garage for the shop, and the home was later lived in by Ken Sheldon. One of the earliest blacksmiths in Sunderland was Thomas Colleran, who ran a shop from 1856 to 1883 on the northwest corner of River and Highway 12. His sons would later work for the T.E. Eaton Company in Toronto as wheelwrights fixing the delivery wagons. In 1883, Henry German built a blacksmith shop in Sunderland. In 1901, the village blacksmith was Thomas Warian and his son Henry. George Kay had a livery and blacksmith shop to the east of the CIBC Bank and down the hill from 1907 to 1955. In 2009, this home was removed, and the site now belongs to Brown & Breather. 123 River Street, the Nipissing House Hotel. In a picture from 1912, the building sign said, Nipissing House Fogg. The owner was Thomas Fogg, and he ran the hotel from 1912 to 1920. He was listed as the proprietor in 1891. About 1868, the Toronto-Nipissing Railway had been built and ran through Sunderland to Cobeconk. The hotel was a long frame building that started at the southeast corner of River and Church Street South and ran to the west. The hotel was built in 1870. It was a great site for boxing matches, wrestling, and dances. Mr. Collins, a local resident, had gamecocks at the back of the property and entertained the guests of the hotel with bird fights. Eventually, the west end of the long building was cut away and turned 90 degrees to face north on River Street. This part of the building became a garage. In 1917, the walkway between the upper levels of the 2 buildings was taken down and it became a separate residence. At one time, there were retail stores on the ground floor of the building. Thomas Fogg lost most of his money through bad investments, and part of the building was bought by John L. Gordon for a car repair service center. The business was sold to Goodison Threshing Mills, and later became a Pontiac Buick franchise. Herb Thompson was an accountant there. The garage was the site for repairing cars and also had a towing service. In 1950, after the Great Fire in Sunderland, the Gordons sold the township of Brock a new GMC fire truck which still remains in mint condition in the fire hall just up Church Street North. Tom Longboat, the famous long-distance runner from the Six Nations Reserve, while at the Nipissing Hotel he bet a man with a horse and buggy that he could outrun them. He easily beat the horse and driver back to the hotel. After 1930, Fred Wakeland opened a tailor shop in the part of the old Nipissing Hotel and made suits there for over 20 years. Before the Oldfields opened their bakery at the Stop For Variety to the east, they were in the Nipissing Hotel. In 1955, Gordon sold City Service Gas. Later, from 1952 to 1967, Stan Will and his wife Myrtle Snodden had a tip-top tailor store here, and they sold dry goods, clothing, and chinaware. After that, there was a florist shop. Carl Humphrey had a barber shop on the corner, and in 1967 the garage was sold to Charles Thompson and converted to a residence. Currently, the Nipissing Hotel building has a laundromat at the east end and several rental apartments throughout the complex. Stop For Variety. This building was at one time owned by Baker Thompson, and it was a grocery and bakery store. Later his son James Thompson ran the business. These men were part of the Sunderland Business Club in 1926. In pictures of the building in early 1912, there was a small balcony above the main entrance with a wrought iron railing surrounding it. The sign above the store said J.W. Thompson. About 1940, this building became the Oldfields Bakery. It was run by the brothers Len and Reg Oldfield and their wives. They sold bulk food, bread, cookies, meats, fruits, and vegetables. The bulk foods were sold by weight, and they had one scale for small items and another one for large, bulky items. They had all kinds of candies, tobacco products, and ran an ice cream parlor. The merchants would wait on the customers from behind the counter and would retrieve items from the shelves. They tallied the cost of the items and put them in the statement book. Many people had a running tab and paid off their debts when they could. The Oldfields had routes throughout the year to deliver bread by wagon and sleigh. The bread was packed in a wooden bread box and placed on the sled in winter. In January 2008, Roy Oldfield did a presentation called Growing Up in Sunderland, telling of the store activities from 1949 to 1964. He told about his experiences in the store. The cookies were Oreos, Fig Newtons, or chocolate-covered marshmallow with jam inside. Vinegar was kept in barrels, and customers brought in their own containers. Oranges were always ordered around Christmas time, so that the children would have them in their Christmas stocking. The crates for the oranges were popular and were made into bedside stands or dressing tables. In the bakery, they made about 120 loaves each day. The oven fire boxes were heated up late at night so that the bread could be ready early in the morning. Cedar wood was used to bring the temperature of the bricks up fast, and then as the flames died down, the bread could be baked. The Oldfields sold cigarettes, cigars, pipe tobacco, and chewing tobacco. At Christmas, they would get flats of 50 cigarettes in a tin box, and they would have some decorative Christmas sleeves on them so that they could be sold as gifts. Often when they delivered the products to the farm, the husbands would rush out to the truck so that they could secretly purchase their tobacco supplies. Part of the store held an ice cream parlor. This was a busy place on a Saturday night. The first ice cream containers were 5-gallon metal containers, and later the tubs were made of cardboard. In those days, the ice cream sundaes were 20 cents, and the banana splits a quarter. Cones were 10 cents for a double scoop. For a penny, you could get jujubes, black balls, or licorice babies. Chocolate bars were only a nickel. Soda pop was 10 cents, and you had a 2-cent deposit. Those were the good old days. As time passed, the store changed to a self-serve operation, and many of the bulk foods became prepackaged. Milk was once in quart bottles, and cream in pint bottles. Many of the new products came in plastic containers. Thus ended the era of the ice cream parlor and individual customer service. The Oldfields sold their business to Lorne Fretchett, and the store was turned into a butcher shop and a grocery. Finally, it became the Stop For Variety. The Old Drug Store. To the east of Stop For was the Rexall Drug Store run by James A. Anderson, who was a pharmacist in Sunderland from 1918 until his sudden death in 1948, while at a local baseball game. Saturday was the busiest day for the store, and he often was open until midnight. James Anderson had been a part of the medical corps in the 182nd Infantry Battalion in World War I. Prior to the war, a map in 1910 shows that the building was a barber and a tailor shop run by Arthur Breather. Before the war, Jimmy Anderson had purchased the Harry Baldwin drugstore that was in the McDermott block on River Street, and later moved to this location when he returned from overseas. Many of the old medicines and bottles from this store are located in the Sunderland Museum on Church Street. He sold perfumes, toilet articles, Kodak film, Nielsen chocolates, and Niles Family Remedies. Jack Anderson, his son, took over the operation of the drugstore after his father died, and Cliff Miller was the pharmacist. Later, Bud Green ran the store around 1959, and after this the business closed. Mike Sheridan started the Sunderland Pharmacy in the building directly to the east of the original drugstore. When Mike Sheridan began the pharmacy next door in 1973, the community had been without a pharmacist for 10 years. George Tassie could up to that point give out counter items, but could not fill any prescribed medicines. In March 2009, the original old drugstore was torn down. The gigantic hand saw. At one time, the present Sunderland Pharmacy was a hardware store. In 1905, this building was owned by Dean Rundle. In 1924, Dean's son Alistair T. Rundle and his wife Vera carried a complete line of hardware that included tools, carpentry goods, and standard household articles in this store. They also sold farm implements and had a storage building to the east of the property. The present building there is Rough Cuts at 99 River Street. A unique sign outside and above the main door of the old store was in the form of a giant hand saw. Printed on the saw was T.A. Rundle Hardware. This unusual artifact is currently in the Sunderland Museum. Alistair Rundle, his wife Vera, and children Irene, Alex, and Jean lived in a house adjacent to the store. When Alistair decided to close up shop, he sold his implements and supplies to Ross Doble. In 1948, the building was sold to Roy Bagg, who had a hardware store here in 1959. When Mike Sheridan bought the building in 1973, it had not been used for several years. Mike ran the pharmacy there from 1971 until 1989. One of the major clients for this store was the administrators of the Sunnydale Home for Children at the Brock Hotel. This was a major boost for the pharmacy and a major convenience for this provincial facility when it came to buying medical supplies. In 1989, a group of pharmacists in Uxbridge purchased the Sunderland Pharmacy. Flindle's Fresh Mart, 97 River Street. This building is shown on the fire insurance maps of Sunderland in 1904 as a hardware store. In 1929, Wilfred Haney bought the building just to the west of the Beale Block. Here he sold farm implements and also Moffat appliances. He had a variety of talents and worked as an electrician, mechanic, and repairman. In 1955, his ad said that he sold Ford cars, trucks, and tractors, as well as fridges and washing machines. Eventually he sold the store to Bob and Jean Young in 1960. They had been in the Beale Block to the east since 1951, and then moved to Mr. Hanley's store so they could expand their business. They stayed here until 1975, and at that time the self-serve store was sold to the Flindle family, and they've been running it for almost 40 years. The store now sells groceries and also operates as an LCBO and beer store. The Beale Block. This set of 3 buildings was named after George Beale, who lived from 1872 until 1939. Currently it contains on the east Kathy's Country Cuts hair salon, La Petite Fleur flower shop, and to the west Katie's Coffee House. On the map of 1910 there's a barber shop at the east side with a general store in the middle and a butcher shop on the west side. Around 1910, Perry McGregor ran a shoe sales and repair store on the east side of the Beale Block for over 25 years. The pictures of around 1912 also show a barber pole and the shop at the east end of the Beale Block. At some point, the Switzers around 1910 had a boot and shoe shop near there. In the middle section of the Beale Block, Lex Gordon and his wife Mary Farrell ran a grocery business in Sunderland in the 1930s. Later this business was sold to James O'Leary. In 1951, Bob and Jean Young bought the grocery store and stayed there until 1960. Then they bought the store where Flindles are now located. Next door to the west, Lex's brother, Arthur Gordon, and his wife Myrtle Good ran a butcher shop. They bought the business from James Christie in 1935. Robert Charter then ran a butcher shop after the Gordons. The sign in the pictures said Charter's Meat Market. In 1962, his nephew, Bryce McGilvery, who was working in the shop, had a sudden heart attack and died in the store. The Harness Shop. To the east of the Beale Block is a private residence owned by the Miller family, and at one time one of their ancestors, Samuel Charter, had a harness shop at the front of the store. While Sam worked through the day, his father-in-law, James Britton, who was a widower after 1919, looked after the shop. Sam still had that shop around 1940. Sam had purchased the house from Mrs. William Doble, Margaret Ruddy, who had moved out of the Doble house at 32 Albert Street after her husband died in 1910. Her son, Claire Doble, moved into that home in 1919 with his new bride, May Toker. Unfortunately, Claire, the newly elected Reeve of Brock, died from the Spanish flu epidemic before he could take office in 1919. Many local families lost loved ones during this contagious illness. The Charters owned many buildings in town, and these included the butcher shop to the west and the funeral home and furniture store across the road. Taylor's Store, 85 River Street. In 1870, Henry Conlon tore down a shed and stable at this site, and a general store was built here. About the start of the 1900s, Matthew Taylor opened his general store at the southwest corner of Albert and River Street. This business was passed on to his son Albert Taylor, and finally to his grandson Lorne Taylor and his wife Margaret Doble. This store offered groceries and dry goods for 3 generations until the couple retired in 1957. After the Taylors owned the store, it was run by William Snowball according to the 1959 phone directory of Sunderland. The 1910 maps show the Home Bank adjacent here on the northwest side of the building on River Street. The Home Bank went bankrupt in 1923 as a result of the crash in the real estate market and loans to Sir Henry Pellet, who built Castle Loma in Toronto. At one point there was also a shoe store in the western section of this building. Nettie Thompson worked for many years as a clerk in the store. Fortunately, the store survived the huge fire across the street in 1949 at the McDermott Block. In 1987, Judy Blears had a bulk food store and sold snacks, candies, and baking goods. In later years, this building was owned by Peter Lawrenson and is the site of an antique store. More recently, it is the location of the Green Spoon Law Office and Art Gallery, and the Country Kitchen restaurant. The William Doble House, 32 Albert Street. About 1857, William Doble and his wife Margaret Ruddy bought this farm from the Jones family. The property was about 90 acres in size. At one time, Sunderland was known as Jones's Corners until the Toronto-Nipissing Railway came through in 1868. The home has been in the Doble family name for several generations. In 1919, Claire Doble moved into the house of his parents, but died from the Spanish flu the same year before he could take office as the newly elected Reeve of Brock Township. His brother Milton Doble and his son Harold Doble owned the house until about 1978. Harold Doble built a new home next door around 1983. The original house is now owned by Herb Gray. The home is about 150 years old and contains hand-forged square-headed nails from the 1860s era. In 1978, the carriage house, old barns, and woodsheds were torn down. The 2-story addition at the rear of the house is not part of the original home. Inside the front portion is a tin ceiling in the living room, and pine doors and pine trim in most of the rooms. The hardwood flooring is made from maple lumber installed in 1938. Early pictures show a large veranda around the south and east sides of the house. The Sunderland Presbyterian Church, Albert Street East. The original church was built just north of the Sunderland Cemetery, and in about 1875, after the Toronto-Nipissing Railroad came through Sunderland, a new church was built at this location. The insurance maps of 1910 show that there was a 30-foot block tower and above it a 15-foot wooden peak. This street was originally called Main Street, but later renamed Albert Street, which causes confusion about the locations of the original buildings. In 1913, the Calhoun Block, just north of the church, was destroyed by fire, and the roof and the tower of the church were damaged. In 1925, the Presbyterian Church joined with the Methodist Church to form the United Church of Canada. After this time, the services were held in the St. Andrew's United Church on Church Street North. The new congregation used the Presbyterian manse, which was on the corner of Albert Street North and Doble Street. The Methodist manse was at the corner of Pine and Water Streets and had been the former home of Robert E. Porritt, a wealthy businessman who owned the McDermott Block. In 1928, the Presbyterian Church was sold to the King Edward Lodge of Sunderland. The building was renovated, officially dedicated in 1929. This building is now home to the Masons and members of the Easter Star charitable organizations. Local families that attended and supported the Presbyterian Church include the Waddells, Pattersons, Tokers, Glendennings, Wallaces, Gillespies, and the Charters. Doyle's General Store, Albert Street, south of the river. In 1912, there was a general store on the east side of Albert Street, located between the McDermott Block and the Presbyterian Church. The insurance maps showed that it was a concrete building. The building was owned by Timothy Pangman and occupied by the Aziz brothers and W.H. Miller. Sometime around midnight on March 5, 1913, a fire broke out from an overheated stove and completely destroyed the building. The nearby Presbyterian Church suffered damage to the roof, woodblock, and tower. There were no casualties as the family living upstairs was able to escape through a second-floor window. This building was at one time called the Calhoun Block and was run by William Calhoun and his wife. Although the damage from the fire was about $25,000, the building had been insured for such a loss. After the Calhouns, the Hurd family owned a grocery store at this location. At the time of the 1949 Sunderland fire, the building had been rebuilt, with William Doyle running a general store south of the McDermott Block and an egg grading station on the east side of the McDermott Block. During the fire, men pushed the east wall of the burning building back into the flames to protect the egg grading station, and helpers rushed to get the chickens and eggs to a safe location. Pictures from 1949 show several men on the roof of Doyle's store using snow to keep the roof cool. George Clay had come to Doyle's store to buy some butter when neighbors alerted him that his restaurant was on fire. The McDermott Block. Nowadays, the southeast corner of Albert and River Streets is the Foxfires restaurant. Years ago, in 1949, there was a whole block of buildings here. Built around 1870, these buildings were originally known as the Porritt Block, and pictures of them are shown in the Ontario County Atlas of 1877. In 1872, William Gordon had a dry goods store in Unit No. 2 of the Porritt Block and sold ready-made clothing and groceries. Dr. McDermott also had a drugstore here at that time. In 1904, the complex had a bank, a post office, a furniture store, and 2 other stores on the ground level. Later, in 1910, the post office, drugstore, and other stores remained, but a new grocery store and office had been added. In 1910, Thomas Welsh was the postmaster here, and in 1913, Harry Baldwin had a drugstore with a telegraph office next door. By the time of the Great Fire in 1949, the area was known as the McDermott Block. In 1949, Jack Allen was the postmaster, and Harry Brandon delivered the mail. George Clay had a restaurant and ice cream parlor in the McDermott Block, and Clayton Henderson ran a barber shop and billiard hall. Neil D. McFadden also had a store and butcher shop at the time. All of these businesses were destroyed when a fire started in George Clay's restaurant at about 9 in the morning and quickly spread throughout the building. Mr. Clay had gone to Doyle's General Store to buy some butter from the clerk, Mabel Wright, when the fire began. Within 3 hours, the entire complex was gone, including 5 stores and businesses, as well as several private residences. Families were left homeless with little more than the clothes on their back. Other than the deadly 1919 influenza virus, this was the most significant tragedy in Sunderland of the 20th century. Fire crews from nearby towns arrived to help cut holes through the ice in the nearby Beaver River to get to a source of water. In this way, they kept the flames from spreading to nearby buildings. Volunteers climbed up on the slippery rooftops in an attempt to put out any embers from the original fire, often with only buckets of water or clumps of snow. Human chains were formed to remove eggs and chickens from the grading station and supplies from Doyle's store. The $200,000 loss of materials and structures was so severe that the buildings were never replaced. A Texaco gas station was placed at the corner from 1950 to 1984. And until 1986, Bill McDougall had a car wash and laundromat here. In July 1986, Lindsay Aluminum Limited put in a branch office owned by Louis Lozenek. Since then, there have been several restaurants at this location, such as the Plow and Harrow, Flink's, the M.E.&.R. Coyote, and most recently, Foxfires. The Sunderland Telephone Company. This company started about 1912, and pictures showing the telephone poles help one estimate the date of the picture. The shares issued are also dated for 1912. The telephone office was on the south side of River Street to the east of the McDermott Block. It is now private residence. In 1912, the president of the phone company was John Glendenning, and the secretary-treasurer was Dr. N. Norman Blanchard. Shares were sold in 1912 for $50, mostly to local owners. In 1929, Harry McGregor, a man with banking experience, took over as the secretary-treasurer. At one point, William Nassau Doble gained control of the phone company and bought up many of the shares when they were as low as $20. Mr. Doble hired Percy Flagler to look after the lines, a task he performed with dedication from 1930 to 1945. After the Second World War, some of the repairmen were George Bagshaw, Wayne Kelly, Paul Brandon, and Bob Fries. The lines were made compatible with Bell about this time. After World War II, Clarence Young returned from overseas and took over as the new repairman. In 1957, James Milton Doble was the president, and Herb Wilson was the secretary-treasurer. Bruce Toker was also involved in managing this company. About 1945, Cora Doble Moore and her husband Cecil Moore ran the telephone office until 1947. There was an office in the front, and they lived at the rear of the house. As time passed, various companies bought the Sunderland Telephone Company until it was finally purchased by Bell Canada. Three of the last technicians to work for the phone company were Leslie Breather, Jim St. John, and Peter Baker. In 1980, when Bell took over, they had to leave Sunderland to keep their jobs. The switchboard operators were replaced in 1968 when the dial-up system was introduced. At this time, thousands of old phones were just taken to the dump when the changeover to the new style was complete. Some of the former switchboard operators were Minnie Wilson, Annie Fair, Yvonne Sheldon, Irene Shire, Hazel Robertson, Hazel Gorrell, and Edith Bagshaw. Gone are the days when you would crank 2 longs and a short to reach the operator and get connected. Also gone were the phone calls where everyone on your line could listen in and hear your conversation. Many telephone systems were started up by doctors wishing to have a better method of communicating with their patients. The home of Thomas Welsh. Thomas Welsh Sr. moved to Sunderland in 1880 at the age of 24. His home was at the southwest corner of River and Cedar Streets. In 1891 he was listed as a grain merchant. He ran Welsh's grist mill, and grain was stored, milled, and sold and shipped by railcar. In 1916 he had a steam generator that ran the mill by day and provided hydro to Sunderland at night, until midnight. In 1950 this business became the Sunderland Co-op. Thomas Welsh was the postmaster from 1894 until 1925. At that time his son Art ran the post office until 1939, and his wife Ruby Miller ran it during the war until 1945. Arthur bought a farm north of the CIBC Bank in 1924 that was on Doble Lane and owned by Alexander Haddon. Art was a pilot in World War I and in command of an anti-tank battery in World War II, and later the MPP for the Muskoka, Ontario riding in 1945. Art was decorated by General Montgomery for his brave actions in the Italian campaign in World War II. He was the Sheriff of Ontario County until 1965. He retired in 1955 and moved with his wife, Ruby Miller, to Whitby. The house in Sunderland went to his son Tom Welsh in 1956. In 1906, the house had a white picket fence and a wooden porch on the southeast side. In 1920, a new cement porch was added to the north and east side of the house. It had large pillars to support upper balconies and a large maple tree on the northeast corner of the lot. The home of James Doble. James Doble was born in 1826 and lived to 1907. He was the brother of William Doble and Margaret Ruddy, who lived at 32 Albert Street. James was a wealthy landowner and had thousands of acres of land between Victoria Corners and Sunderland. It was once said that you could walk from Victoria Corners to Sunderland and always be on Doble land. At one time, James Doble was involved with the Doble Bank in Sunderland, and he later sold it to the Home Bank. On the maps of 1904, the Home Bank was on the west side of Taylor's store and attached to it. James Doble lived at the corner of River and Cedar Streets on the southeast corner. About 1900, he developed a plan for the lots on both sides of River Street, and it involved about 60 building lots from Highway 12 right up to the CIBC Bank at Albert Street. Because of this, the street by the Sunoco station was called Doble Street, and the first road to the west was called James Street. When James Doble died, his home was lived in by his wife Mary Jane Ray and his stepdaughter Lottie Ray. James Doble was a very generous man. He donated the land for the St. Mary's Church Rectory in 1874, and that land was used by the ministers until 1942. He also donated land to the St. James West Brock Church on the 4th of Brock in Durham 23 for church picnics and functions in the summertime and after services. James, like many of the Dobles as far back as 1834, was buried in the St. James West Brock Cemetery. When he died, he left many farms, homes, and building lots to his nephews and nieces in his will. About 1972, the safe for the Doble Bank was still in the front living room of this house. Lottie Ray married Wes Doble and stayed in the home until 1984. When the estate was sold, the home was full of antiques, and the future owners found money hidden in the walls. The nephews of James Doble knew of his generosity and would often wear their worst beaten-up old shoes if there was a chance they might run into Uncle James. He would scold them about those miserable boots and immediately rush them off to the shoe store to get a new pair. The home of William Nassau Doble. William Nassau Doble was a very smart businessman and retired from farming at the age of 42. He owned several farming properties and later donated some of them to his nephews. At one time he had interest in the Sunderland Telephone Company and bought up many of the shares when their value was low. Later, in 1957, his brother Milton James Doble was the president of the telephone company. Since there are so many William Dobles, his nickname was Gypsy Bill because of the colorful scarves he wore on his neck. William Doble was one of the 9 people from Sunderland that went to France for the unveiling of the Vimy Monument in 1936. A relative of his, Lieutenant John James Doble, had been killed at Vimy Ridge in April 1917. William and his wife Mary Alice McFadden were strong supporters of the Scotch Cemetery near Manila and the St. Mary's Anglican Church. His parents were the William Doble and Margaret Ruddy, who lived at 32 Albert Street. His brother Clare had died of the flu before taking office as Reeve of Brock in 1919. The home of Robert Doble, 48 River Street. Robert Doble was a nephew of the banker James Doble. After Robert died in 1949, his son Floyd Doble left the farm on the 4th of Brock and lived in this house. Floyd kept a shotgun near the heating vent in his bedroom above the front door. Rumor has it that Floyd still sits in that rocking chair guarding the entrance to his home. It's said that one time, when the house was being sold, a potential buyer examined the house and found an elderly gentleman rocking in a chair in the upper bedroom. He spoke to the buyer, saying that this would be a good home. Needless to say, the sale did not go through, and the real estate agent told the potential buyer that the house was completely empty. When E.G. Sutherland managed the Western Bank in Sunderland, about 1902, guarding the bank at night from the upstairs apartment was considered part of his duties. Later, the Robert Doble house was the site of an antique shop called the Glass Garage. Many of those antiques came from the sale of the estate of Wes Doble. The Bank, River Street. Today, the CIBC Bank sits on the northeast corner of River and Albert Streets. In 1902, a branch of the Western Bank of Canada opened in Sunderland. The maps of 1904 showed the bank as the Western Bank, but by 1910 it shows it had become the Standard Bank. Because of the weakening and eventual crash of the stock market in 1929, banks joined forces to stay in business. In 1928, the Standard Bank was bought out by the Bank of Commerce. Then, in 1961, the Imperial Bank of Canada amalgamated to form the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, or CIBC. This is truly a historic structure in Sunderland and is over 100 years old. During the Great Fire of 1949, the staff of the bank and nearby citizens stood on the roof and helped to keep the fire from spreading. This was a dangerous task considering the cold and slippery conditions. Inside the bank, the staff rushed to put all the ledgers and documents back in the vault to protect it from burning. Apparently, when the home bank first started, it was beside Taylor's store, and then it moved over to Bagshaw's Hardware, and that eventually became the Home Hardware. In the early 1900s, the branches of the Western Bank here and in Pefferlaw were managed by E.G. Sutherland. Another early bank in Sunderland was the Doble Bank of 1886, which was bought out by the Home Bank. The latter bank went insolvent about 1922 during a real estate value crash. The Brock House Hotel, 82 River Street. This 3-story brick building was constructed in 1910 with the supervision and financing of Dr. James McDermott, who lived from 1845 to 1920. At that time, the main road through town came right up to the hotel. It was a wonderful place for a meal, but after 1904 it was illegal to serve alcohol in dry Sunderland. This often cut into business. Some of the owners included Jim Thompson, who also owned the Stop 4 building at River and Church Street, and Sam Ainsworth. Sam Ainsworth bought the building in 1935 from the township of Brock. George Shire ran the hotel from 1944 until 1965. In 1966, the government of Ontario bought this hotel and created the Sunnydale Home for Children. This facility cared for up to 77 challenged children and employed as many as 60 staff. Finally, after 23 years, the facility was closed and the residents were moved into group homes. Later, the building was renovated and turned into a retirement residence. The hotel was always a central place in the early years for salesmen and vacationers to visit. In 1945, a special banquet was held here to honor the veterans of both World Wars. In 1840, this building was a log structure owned by the Jones family. At that time, Sunderland was known as Jones's Corners. From then until 1910, the building had burned down several times. Fortunately, the wind direction in the Great Fire of 1949 came from the northwest, and the flames from the burning McDermott block across the road were carried away from the Brock Hotel. Even so, George Shire stood atop the hotel and used a bucket brigade to keep the embers from igniting the roof. Today, the building is known as Victoria Manor, a retirement residence. The hardware store, 92 River Street. Early maps and photos show the home bank in 1904 to the west of Taylor's store on the south side of River Street. At some point before 1920, the home bank had moved across the street to where Elgin Bagshaw ran his hardware store from 1920 to after 1970. While the vault was still there, the Bagshaws would let customers use the safety deposit boxes for their valuables. Above the store was a sign promoting Murphy's Paints and Narvo products in the early 40s. Elgin Bagshaw was a member of the Sunderland Business Association in 1926. After the Bagshaw family left, Hugh MacDonald and the Pilgrim family opened a home hardware store here. In 1982, they purchased the east side of the Thorne Funeral Home and started the Sunderland Homeland Furniture Store. The Early Undertaker, 96 River Street. The earliest undertaker in the area was G.A. Leach in the Atlas of 1877 for the County of Ontario. Most undertakers also had a business making and selling furniture. In the early days, the family held the funeral service at the home of a relative and then went directly to the cemetery. Up until 1915, the building that is now Sunderland Homeland Furniture was run by Robert Charter. He had a furniture business and was also the undertaker. In 1906, he provided the seats for the new Sunderland Town Hall. These seats were unique and had a spot at the base of the chair for the gentlemen to store their hats during a performance at the hall. After 1915, Lorne Pinkham owned this business. Part of the main floor was the funeral parlor, and the other parts were used as living quarters for his family and for the display of furniture. At the back of the store was a stable large enough to hold 2 milking cows. Lorne wished to keep his links to farm life and rented some land south of Sunderland. This property was later known as Piggyland in the scam that happened in 1960. Ralph Pinkham carried on the business from about 1943 to 1969. About January of 1969, John Thorne came to Sunderland to run this business, and in 1973 it became the Thorne Memorial Chapel. The original funeral parlor was moved to the west at Thorne, and the Pinkham building became part of the home hardware business owned by the Pilgrim family. The printing shop, 98 River Street. On the map of 1910, this building is divided into 2 parts. To the west, the store sold implements, and to the east there was a print shop. From 1907 to 1940, Wesley Christopher Miller ran a grocery store here with the help of his daughter Mabel. Harry Chambers lived on the 2nd floor and provided help to local farmers with his knowledge of animal husbandry. To the east, in the other half of the building, Bill Harris had a shoe repair shop. During the time frame of 1939 to 1945, Philip St. John sold farm supplies in this part of the building. John Thorne established the Thorne Memorial Chapel here in 1973 and continues this service up until the present date. The Magic Door, 100 River Street. The most recent building constructed here was finished in 1892, as shown by the stone engraving at the top front of the Magic Door Art Gallery. The insurance maps from 1910 show that there was a hardware store here. At one time, this was a barber shop and tailor store run by Art Breather. He had moved in 1918 from his store next to the Stop 4 across the street to this location. Art lived from 1870 to 1949 and was a barber for about 35 years in Sunderland. When Art retired, Lionel Gervais ran the barber shop, and he had a pool hall in the back. Next, Ralph Pinkham had about 4 apartments in this building, and Mary Giroux and her husband Barry O'Neill lived here. In 1972, Bill Urema bought the building from Ralph Pinkham. The front of the building was restored to the original condition, and the art gallery was created from the front apartment. When tenants moved out of the back apartments, the gallery was expanded to the rear of the building. The Magic Door Art Gallery and Studio was established in 2001 and has 1,400 square feet of display space for a variety of impressive collections. One of the most outstanding collections was the work of Lewis Parker. It contained 36 pictures and murals showing the daily lives of Native Americans from the Huron Nation. During that display, the artist also donated his painting of St. Mary's Anglican Church to the Sunderland Historical Society. "104 River Street. The Legion was formed in 1929 and celebrates its 80th anniversary this year. It's correctly known as the Royal Canadian Legion, Brock Branch No. 141. In 1949, the Ladies' Auxiliary was formed. In 1958, the Legion bought the house of Dr. Robert Grierson and used it for their meetings and Legion activities. Later, the property next door was purchased. In 1973, the new Legion Hall was built, and this is the building that you see today. Recently, the Legion received funds from a federal New Horizons for Seniors grant to renovate the building and purchase new furniture. All of the details about the history of this building and the veterans of branch number 141 have been described in the 2009 commemorative calendar about this site. The mandate of the Legion is to look after the welfare of local veterans and their families and to provide support for community activities as those needs arise. The cenotaph at the Town Hall displays the names of the 23 servicemen killed in World War I and the 16 servicemen killed in World War II from the Sunderland area. It was built in 1922 to honor and remember those veterans. The Legion now provides a variety of services to the community. These include shuffleboard, euchre, bingo, breakfast and lunches, and ballroom dancing. The Legion is also an inexpensive venue for the celebration of various social events. 108 River Street. This home at one time belonged to Ada Marquis. Her family lived near Leaskdale, and she was a very close friend to Lucy Maud Montgomery, the author of Anne of Green Gables. In 1920, she was married to Robert Dusto by Reverend Ewan MacDonald, Lucy's husband. Bob Dusto was a butcher in the Beale Block. They farmed just west of Sunderland, and after Bob died in 1950, his wife Ada moved into this house with her sister, Mabel Prentice, and her husband Russell, and their young son Ralph Prentice. After Ada Marquis left, the home was bought by R. W. Groves, who was a veterinary surgeon. When Dr. Groves came to Sunderland in 1944, he first stayed with his cousin William Suggett, and then moved into town. Dr. Groves also bought the store next door from William Haney for a dispensary office. When Dr. Groves moved to Cannington, the next owners in 1956 were Carl and Ava Umphrey. Carl ran a barber shop here, and it was a social center for all of the local euchre players. Carl was also the chief of the volunteer fire department. Freeze Creamery, Church Street North. It's kind of hard to believe that the fire hall on Church Street North was once a creamery. After getting a degree at Guelph College and working with his uncle at a creamery in Belleville, Elwood Free decided to go into business for himself. In 1936, he and his wife Helen Ray drew up plans and built a creamery at this location. After 4 years, the building was sold to Brock Township as a fire hall, and the creamery was relocated to the east side of Highway 12, opposite Morrow Farm Equipment. Elwood's first task was to drive all over the township to collect cream from various farms. The churned butter was molded using a wooden press and individually wrapped into 1-pound packages. The large cream cans were steamed and cleaned by hand. As new machinery was installed, the process was sped up, and eventually 2,200 pounds of butter could be ready in an hour. Now they could deliver butter to Toronto by truck and often return with a load of feed for local farmers. After 1969, the Frees retired and Don Brooks was the manager from 1977 until 1991. Back in 1936, when the township of Brock bought the original creamery site to use as a fire hall, there was not that much equipment, and during the 1949 fire, the local fire truck broke down. In 1950, the township bought a new $10,000 GMC fire truck, and that vehicle, in mint condition, is still kept on hand for parades and community events. Another GMC truck was added to the fire hall about 1970. The Sunderland Memorial Arena, 1948 to 2009. The Brock Memorial Community Center Arena was built in 1948 at a cost of $20,000, and it had a large ice surface and seating capacity for 1,400 people. This was a project organized by the members of the Sunderland Legion Branch No. 141. Stanley Miller, James A. Anderson, and Dr. T. McLennan were key members who organized this project. Prior to this new facility, skating took place at an outdoor rink at the Agricultural Building in the fairgrounds. In 1957, major damage occurred to the recreational center in Sunderland when a hurricane swept through town. Artificial ice was installed in 1965, and a major front addition was added in 1971 with washrooms, change rooms, a snack bar, and a large social room on the second floor for receptions and dances. Because of safety concerns, the north end of the rink was torn down and rebuilt in 1976. Recently, in 2002, money was received from a Super Bill grant initiative, and an elevator and accessible washroom were added to the building. The Sunderland Harvesters won several hockey championships through the years in this arena. Now, it is an important site for fundraisers, concerts, dances, fair events, and sport activities.